Much for
Thank you.
coming, Senator.
Thank you.
I must say your remarks summarized this problem in a very efficient, effective way, and it really demonstrates your commitment on this issue. You are in the United States Senate, where I used to work as a staffer, the member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in point of fact, the subcommittee chairman for the Western Hemisphere, a member of the Intel Committee, and a member of the Appropriations Committee, which makes you my new best friend as we go after these important issues.
Hold on, I forgot to turn the mic on. Did I turn it on for you?
I think it was on.
I knew that one was on.
So
how did that mic work even when I had it off?
the report that we've presented here makes recommendations in a couple of areas. The use of this asymmetrical tool, OFAC sanctions, as a way of getting at kingpins, but also to identify where their assets are and freeze those assets. This is extraordinarily important in terms of the narco kingpins who are heading Venezuela and tormenting and killing its people, and the FARC kingpins who claim that they, as what the Justice Department called the biggest cocaine producing organization in the world, didn't make a profit because they don't have any money except a few ranches here and there and what they can carry in a knapsack. But there are others who postulate that they have anywhere from between $2 and $10 billion. How would you react to the idea of an initiative that really insists that the U.S. executive branch go after these things, targets as priorities, to seize those assets and maybe, if necessary, new legislation to give them the authority to repatriate that money to Colombia or stolen assets to Venezuela?
Well, and I think a lot of the framework for that already exists in the current law. I think it's a matter of policy and directive, ordering or instructing Treasury and all the elements of our international power to identify where these funds are being placed and to use our influence over the world banking system to gain access to these funds, and not to keep them for ourselves, but rather to send them to these countries to help fund their efforts. And in the meantime, also kind of make clear to transnational groups that the world banking system is not their playground, that they will not be allowed to continue to use it to launder their funds or to hide away their ill-gotten gains at the expense of the people of these nations. But I do think it's an important tool that should be applied and that can be applied, but I just know from limited experience now up here for 7 years, or 6.5 years, that in many of these agencies, it isn't going to happen unless they're specifically directed to do as a policy initiative. And it's one of the strongest recommendations of the AEI report that I hope can turn into a directive for policymakers.
Regarding Colombia, it's one of the most important issues that we're confronting as the Colombians grapple with this 60-year-old insurgency, Marxist-Leninist group that hasn't renounced the armed conflict, but has not renounced its Marxist-Leninist objectives. How can we best assist them in that process as we endeavor not to just save the peace process, but frankly to save Colombia from this criminality?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we recognize that Colombia is a republic, a democracy. Its leaders are elected, and its leaders are responsive to the people of Colombia. As their partner, I think it's our obligation to make them understand that we are prepared to continue to contribute to these efforts, which, took a nation that was on the verge of collapse, of being a failed state, and brought it to a point of relative prosperity and security for a significant period of time. And I think we're prepared to continue to endeavor to help in that regard. What I don't think we can allow, and this is as an American senator or someone who needs to answer the people of Florida and of the country about how their taxpayer money is being spent, is that any of those funds would be used to somehow unfairly benefit the FARC. For example, not seeing, we want to make sure that our funds are being used for things like ensuring that that the systems are set up so victims are compensated, and not through American funds, but through the FARC funds. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that there isn't the creation of these courts whereby the people who partnered with us to confront these groups are now being unfairly put on trial and treated like criminals themselves. And we certainly want to make sure that none of the funds of the American taxpayer winds up in the hands of a group that we still designate as a terrorist group. Mm-hmm. And many of those leaders are still wanted for extradition, I think upwards of 60, for crimes committed against the United States and against our citizens. So I think as long as we're fair and frank and direct and to the point, we'll have an opportunity to work with the Santos administration and with whatever succeeds this administration in Colombia. In the absence of that, I think, unfortunately, if in fact our dollars are not producing results, there could be real challenges to continuing our partnership in this regard. And I think to me, this is not just about preserving our relationship. It's about ensuring that we're getting results from it that we can justify to the American taxpayer at a time when there is an effort to reduce U.S. foreign engagement in the world, both direct and indirect.
The president just made took some steps regarding U.S. policy toward Cuba and engagement with the Cuban regime. One of the things that the Obama administration was very proud of was this so-called anti-drug cooperation with the Castro government. And we were told by the administration in some private briefings that that sort of thing would continue. How would you assess the value of that kind of cooperation? How do we ensure that it is used for our essential national security interests?
The cooperation, I'm sorry,
with the Cuban regime.
Okay. Well,
in anti-drug area, because they're in the clearly in the transit zone.
Well, I think, first of all, it benefits the Cuban government not to find itself in this situation, and they've had a history in the past of strong allegations about what they allowed to occur within its country. Our goal in Cuba is pretty straightforward, and that is we want a nation that has the same rights as people virtually everywhere in this hemisphere. Over the last 20 years, every country in the Western Hemisphere has had at least one free and fair election, except for Cuba. And that may not be the case any longer in places like Nicaragua and certainly in places like Bolivia and in Venezuela. But they've had some experience with democracy over the last 2 decades, except for Cuba. And we remain hopeful that that day is coming. Understanding that it isn't going to be from one day to the next, there'll be a process of transition. But we want to ensure that American policy towards Cuba is incentivizing that, as opposed to providing funds for the status quo to become embedded and take even deeper roots as a new generation of leadership, which is the goal of the Castro regime, is to have the world basically accept their system, their undemocratic system of government, and the military's control of the economy, and have its kind of the concrete dry on that, and become a permanent fixture in the hemisphere. And that's something that U.S. foreign policy should not be encouraging. Within that realm, I think it behooves the Cuban government, even this repressive one, to cooperate with everyone when it comes to drug trafficking. The worst thing that could possibly happen for them is to once again be designated as a nation that cooperates with transnational criminal groups, because I believe that it would further isolate them from the region and ultimately from the world.
Do you think it's possible, those of us who understand what's going on in Venezuela, I know you certainly do, understand that Cuba is playing an extraordinarily intimate role in managing affairs
Well, the Maduro would not have remained in power had it not been for Cuban interference, direct interference, and not just through advice, but by embedding personnel within the security agency and apparatus. You see today that many of the key functions in the Venezuelan government are operated by Cuban operatives who came over from the island for that purpose. And so it is a direct, basically, invasion of the institutions of Venezuela. Whether it's the personal protection that surrounds Maduro, the passports and documentation office, or even how the National Guard is confronting protesters in the streets, all of these things are being directed, and in many ways by Cubans, and in many ways are directly participating in these acts. So there is no doubt in the minds of any Venezuelan, and there should be no doubt in the minds of people in the hemisphere, that the Cuban government is the single biggest reason why Maduro and is unconstitutional. Because that's the thing we need to point to all the time. A lot of my colleagues are not aware of this. That what protesters and the opposition in Venezuela are asking for is for them to follow the Constitution. The Chavez Constitution, by the way, that calls for like elections every 2 years and for the National Assembly to be its chief legislative body. And all of these things have been canceled and ignored, all of it through the assistance, the direct assistance of the Cuban regime.
Fair enough, very clear. But we call Venezuela a narco state. We say that Maduro's family is directly involved. Former president of the National Assembly is involved, vice president's directly involved. If that's the case and Cuba is managing Venezuela, is the Cuban government complicit?
Absolutely,
would you suggest?
Of course they are. The Cubans are well aware of how these people have made their money and what they do. And obviously their conscience is not heavy in terms of being cooperative in that regard. I imagine what you've probably seen in the last 15 years, although I would imagine there's still slippage, is that the Cuban government has decided perhaps not to allow Cuba to be a direct transit point, but that doesn't mean they're not supporting these networks. And there's a reason why the Cuban government was the host for many of these negotiations with the Colombians, and that is their relationship with the FARC that they knew was a narco-trafficking group. And they've also provided support for them and in many cases asylum and or protection for some of its key leaders.
Yeah, well stated, well stated. There are some who are skeptical about the so-called war on drugs, this overall coercive strategy. As someone here asks, what would you say to those who disagree with your views on that, whatever those?
Well, you see the impact that drug abuse has in this country, and it's illegal. Imagine if it was legal and allowed, because many ways people take cues about, there's an adage that if something's not illegal, it can't be that bad. So there's no doubt this country is paying a tremendous price already for an abuse of drugs, and I said that in my statement. One of the biggest things we can do to help with this is to deal with our consumption issue here in the United States, which is a major one. Without U.S. consumption, that's the single greatest market for these groups. But I think it goes further than that. If you look at these transnational criminal groups, they are parasitic entities. They are a cancer. They undermine and directly undermine and threaten the rule of law in any one of these countries. They control territory, converting them into ungoverned spaces. They undermine the security. They corrupt institutions. They undermine the international community or the international business community's confidence in the countries that they're in. They are an enormous security threat. In many parts of those countries, they directly rival the government in terms of their ability to provide money and even security or whatever they call security. All of these things are major threats. If you look at the migratory pressures that we face in the United States, a lot of it is people fleeing MS-13 violence in Central America, and all other sorts of problems throughout the region. So in the end, if our hope is to have stable nation states where people are prosperous and come to the United States because they either come here legally or because they come here to invest or come here as tourists, if that is our goal, you can't do that in nations in which a significant amount of its capital is being spent managing these attacking these groups, taking these groups on, and you can't do that in places in which these transnational criminal groups undermine the very legitimacy of the state.
Another one of our computer literate friends asked, you call the Mexican government, quote, a willing partner. Is that partnership at risk with the upcoming Mexican elections?
I hope not. Ultimately, that's up for the people of Mexico to decide. I mean, it's not Venezuela, it's not Cuba. They're going to have a free and fair election, and they're going to decide new leadership, and that'll be debated. Our hope is that we're prepared to work with whoever wins, and should be, because it's an important relationship. And so obviously that's a question that'll be answered in the upcoming elections there. But my hope is that it remains steady, irrespective. And I think it's in the best interest of Mexico and the United States for that to be the case.
One of the concerns, going back to Colombia, is whether the Colombian government would have sufficient resources to take on the so-called FARC dissidents or the BACRIM, these criminal organizations that have not taken advantage of the peace process but are going to continue in their criminality. Do we need to think about the shifting U.S. support over to the security side of things more than the economic and social side?
In Colombia?
In Colombia, yes.
I think they're interrelated. It's very difficult to have economic growth and stability if you don't have security first. Companies are not going to invest capital in places where they feel threatened and or they think the rule of law doesn't apply. Tourism isn't going to grow. People aren't going to visit places that they think are inherently dangerous. You know, we had a bombing at a mall that killed 3 people in Colombia a few weeks ago as an example. If we were to return to those days, that would be problematic. So they're interrelated. And obviously a state cannot fund governmental services unless it has an economy that generates the revenue necessary for those purposes. So they're intricately related. Security has to exist before there can be economic growth. You can't have one without the other.
And a related question here on NAFTA. Would you say that NAFTA has played a role in driving impoverished Mexicans and Central Americans into drug smuggling to make ends meet?
I wouldn't say that that's the case. I think NAFTA, like any trade deal, has benefits and costs, and that's part of economic commerce. And if you're an American farmer, NAFTA has been really good. If you're an American manufacturer, or at least someone manufacturer sector worker, NAFTA has been threatening to you in some respect. I think it has to be viewed in the context of holistically what it's meant overall. By and large, I think that the relationship between not just Mexico, the United States, and Canada, the market has been a general positive. Like any trade deal that was created before the internet exploded, before Google and all these other, Amazon existed, there's a need to modernize it, and there's an effort to do that now, and I think it's moved in a way that's been very positive, at least up to this point. But ultimately, I think it behooves us. I think NAFTA properly modernized is an answer, not a problem.
One final question, and you've been very generous with your time.
Let me just add one more point.
Yes,
I apologize.
please. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you hear in a lot of these countries is they want to get into crop replacement, right? Where they want to go in and basically convince someone who's in the drug economy to produce something else. And so in Colombia, it's been an effort to produce cacao or chocolate, and that's going to have to be some really good chocolate to equate the what the cost benefits are from being in drug production. So you need to provide economic opportunities beyond simply agriculture for people not to be dependent on that sort of thing for their economic wherewithal, and so that's a key component. Economic growth can contribute to security if it can provide an environment where people do not have to rely on those nefarious industries to provide for their families.
Well, I have to admit I have a bigger problem with chocolate than I do have with cocaine.
Yeah.
One final question.
I'm not against them going the chocolate direction. I'm just saying that alone is not going to do it.
Would certainly benefit, I suppose. One final question. How do you believe that sanctuary cities affect our ability to combat transnational organized crime?
Well, I imagine, to the extent that people believe that they can violate laws and their migratory status will not put them in danger of interacting with law enforcement, I think it's problematic. I don't believe that if you got rid of sanctuary cities, it's going to solve your problem, though. These are intricate networks of distribution that include Americans on this side of the border that are part of that network. If you look at the network of distribution, the cross-border operation may involve nationals of other countries, but once it gets to I-10 and comes east towards the southern states and then up north on 95, those are American organized crime groups that are helping with the distribution internally. So it's called transnational for a reason. And that is, these are intricate networks and organizations that operate across borders using nationals on multiple countries, including distributors at the state and local level that are Americans, who are the typical heroin dealer in the United States is not from some other country. It is someone who lives here. Now, the supply may have been trafficked in from multiple countries throughout the region, but ultimately we have a distribution network within this own country, too, that needs to be confronted. And sanctuary cities is not going to deal with that.
I lied. Let me ask one more question. And I think it's a good provocative one and gives you an opportunity to get on the right side of the White House. I think you already are, I'm sure.
On some things, yeah.
Yeah. Good luck with that. Definitely, Brian. The president gets a lot of criticism. He isn't standing up his team quickly enough, and the State Department. This is something that came up with Secretary of State Tillerson a while back. How do you think he's doing so far in Latin America? And I have my own, I guess I have to admit I've been positively surprised by how he's oriented, where his team is headed, and what direction they're headed on a couple of different crises that we're confronting. How would you rate that, and what do you think his biggest priority needs to be?
I think there's a willingness to be more engaged in the Western Hemisphere. It's not like we're going from an era of hyper-engagement to a dramatic drop-off. I think by and large the Western Hemisphere has been largely neglected since the end of the Cold War. And that remains the case. And you see that both in the professionals entering the field and also just in where our attention is. And for obvious reasons, right? After 9/11, a lot of the focus was on the Middle East. Now with Russia and Crimea and Ukraine, that's captured a lot of attention. And the history of the 21st century will largely be determined by the relationship between the U.S. and China and the Asia-Pacific region in general. But I think there's a willingness to be more engaged in the region and an understanding that regional stability is one of the most important things we can do for economic prosperity and our own internal security here in the United States. So I think there's a willingness to be more engaged in it, and hopefully that we can provide input as to what that means and how best to construct it.
Well, we thank you very much, Senator, for your terrific discussion of this issue. Obviously, your serious attention that you're giving this problem that we're confronting, and identifying opportunities for getting ahead of the crisis. Thank you very much. God
Thank
bless,
you.
and I want to thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you.